I think that's that's something that we need to recognise, these different sort of modes of engagement. I think one of the challenges is, or one of the objectives, it seems, or maybe the assumption is, that what you're trying to do is create a sort of a flat terrain, like where everybody's having exactly the same sort of experience. But the reality is that you're not going to be able to get that. So in a way, maybe one way to think about it is, how do you optimize the different types of engagement in that scenario? So what was really interesting about that session, I mean, we were mob-handed. There were a lot of us and we've got Gravity Sketch here, 4 people delivering tuition, essentially sort of chalk and talk tuition on how to use a piece of software. We've then got a group of students and staff members who were in headsets trying to act out the instruction, and we got some students observing the process. So they were absorbing information about the software, but also watching other people participate. It's almost like a sort of an old school surgical, sort of surgeon sort of lesson. But at the same time, as Gravity Sketch was speaking, students were working on the VR headset. Chris is acting as a sort of interlocutor with the MA students, with a piece of equipment as well, saying, this is what's happening now. This is how this is. And so, in a way, that moment was sort of extraordinary. I mean, you're not normally that well resourced in that scenario, but actually there's something happening in all of those different dynamics that we probably need to spend a bit of time pulling apart and understanding more. It's a bit like the moment when we were watching the AOI session, Katie, when you just said, watch how people are having tutorials, and just watch what's happening, because you're having a conversation as though somebody is there right next to you, but actually they could be 5,000 miles away. There's something about proximity and the nature of the sort of studio moment, which is captured in that. That's a really good thing, I think, that can happen through the technology. So those little moments, those bits of dynamic, I think, need to be leveraged, or at least we need to be able to isolate them, describe them back to ourselves, and then augment them in some way.
The first example you talked about is kind of a staggered approach, isn't it? Where, because those MA students, their next session was the session almost that they came and observed. Yeah. So it wasn't a complete kind of new thing for them.
It's like waiting to go on a roller coaster.
Yeah,
basically.
Absolutely.
So that was the 17 students that we then got into headsets, and the half had the business and half had the consumer. And that actually went quite smooth, didn't it, actual workshop? Because maybe because of that, because they sat and observed. So maybe that is the way to go if you have a combination of people, is just say, because the collab bit is not quite there yet, maybe we just say observe, they're observers.
They were MA students and they were overseas students. I think there's a big difference between how different levels of students feel comfortable in, not just with the technology, but in that environment where you're asking them to kind of just, I guess, break some of their walls, dismiss some of their walls, and just learn from scratch. And I think the MA students seem to be more comfortable in doing that. And the MA group is largely all overseas students, and something we've noticed here actually are overseas, and by overseas I mean mainly Chinese students. They seem a lot more open to technology than our home students. So with the MA group, they embraced it really quickly, and also it was the reader group that had specifically selected that area of investigation, wasn't it? So they were quite open to those ideas, and probably were bringing prior knowledge with them.
Sure.
I mean, we haven't really tested this that much with year one on BA, for example.
No. I'm thinking about Mick's sort of pre and post survey, which was exactly the same survey yesterday. It's quite good. I mean, it's a good way of testing that small moment, but also it might be quite useful for us to have something that's that quick and simple to try out, maybe with student groups, just to say where they're at, so you've got a sense of the levelness of those.
And maybe how they see their role within the learning.
Yeah.
So those who are the observers, understanding that passive role and actually what that gives to them.
Yeah.
So actually enabling them to articulate the different dynamics as well.
Yeah.
But it's we're both looking at, and they're both looking at feeding back.
Also, they wanted to get in. Something like, what they're in headset. I'm not. I want to get in there.
It's,
It's managing that.
it's created a real sense of
Yeah.
excitement when we have been doing workshops. Almost every session, students walking past or tutors
With
walking
windows.
past. Then what is this? How can we do this? How can we sign up for it? So as soon as you start implementing things, it tends to snowball.
But it's important to have the activity cast onto a screen as well. As a sort of, it's a bit shameless. It's promoting the activity as students are walking past, but actually if they can see a space, particularly illustrators, they can see a person in a space drawing something. They start to get really, they start to get quite sort of excited about the prospect of it. I mean, there's something about VR as well, which is sort of performative, right? You can be in your own, you are literally in this other space, so you've got no sort of, you're not that bothered about how you look, right? You're doing it because you're concentrating on the task in hand. Shall we move on with this? So Katie and I were charged with delivering this session. So what we did was basically steal the document that Jenny's made and use that as the basis for what we do. As you know, we have to produce a number of case studies, and the plan is to work in partnership with different institutions in different ways that I think suit us individually. And Jenny shared this document with me. I think yesterday we had a quick look at it, but I think it's a really super useful, very concise, clear document that helps us form our approach to writing case studies. And I've done this, I mean, sorry, this is just me going through it and highlighting bits that I thought would be useful. So I don't read too much into the yellow highlights, it's just my brain working. But I think there are certain elements of this that are useful to bear in mind in the context of what we're going to do over the next hour or so. We've got until about 3:30 max, I think, to run this workshop. And I think this, for me, I mean, you put it in bold there, Jenny, is really important to hold on to and remember, because it might be easy to just get tied up in the idea of producing something that you think is a case study, but the notion that what we produce is valuable, accessible and useful for us and others to use feels like it's a really nice bit of affordance in the document, because we're all doing things in our own sort of inimitable way, and we're probably all sort of thinking, well, Julian's doing it that way, am I doing it wrong? But actually we're all doing it in different sorts of ways, so that felt very reassuring. Thank you for that. And I like the idea as well that we might be producing a resource on how we use this immersive eco system or applied it, which again we're trying to, I think at our end, we're trying to ensure that the activity that we undertake has a lifespan, has some degree of sustainability. It's not just going to end when this project ends, that it becomes a thing that can be live and used for for as long as it's useful. And so basically, I don't know, Katie, is there anything else that you want to chip in? Are you happy for me to just monologue? Right, fine. Well, you've done it now, I will. What we thought would be useful is to look at this, again, super useful list of suggested content and structure for documenting the case studies. And I boiled it down to, in my own sort of simpleton way, to kind of what, why, how and where. We have now 1 hour. So first task is what's happened so far. Now, I think it might just be useful, and Jenny, I'm sort of looking to you to see if you think this would work. If we work maybe we just do a round table discussion, because I don't think all of the pairings are here necessarily. But if we could just start conversations about how we are, what we've done so far in terms of case studies, what kind of activities we think might be applicable to case studies going forward, and what things are noticeable. So I think it can be everything from the descriptive through to the kind of evaluative, and start from there, really. That's task number 1. That's fairly straightforward.
Yeah, and I'm happy to represent the case studies that aren't here. Who's online? Perhaps that would be useful if I just run through run through the pairings, and that's probably going to summarise things. Of course, there's Darryl and Julian from UAL, illustration and IATD, 3D design, model making, digital art. Hopefully we'll hear a little bit about what, and of course yourself as well, that we'll hear about some of your actions already. We've got Aoife from IATD, who teaches light drawing.
Yes.
And paired with Alexander from Genovitsi, who specialises in fine art. Their pairing has been understandably delayed, so they're going to be working a long time on too. I'll reshare the guidance document with everyone so that we've got an idea of that amended timeline. It was sent a little while ago, but I know what it's like, so I can resend that so you can kind of check the timeline and schedule things. But Aoife and Alexander's basic ideas were kind of thinking around, because they're both concentrating on kind of drawing skills, perhaps considering the role of lighting for still life, drawings within the virtual realm, the kind of lighting capacities and the physics of those spaces. So that was one of their initial ideas. Esther and Miroslava literally met an hour ago. Yes, about half an hour ago, to initiate their case study, which would be a case study from School of Form, graphic design, silkscreen printing, and Miroslava, who is obviously at Genovitsi, teaching fashion and accessory design. So their case study literally just started, and obviously they'll be working on the second timeline as well. But I think one of the things you were interested in, and one of the things that was revealed through that conversation, was how both of your courses are very practical, hands-on, material courses. And the major hurdle that presents, we can kind of get our heads around how to show outcomes in virtual space, how to create, but actually the materiality, the physicality of those processes is one of the big hurdles and challenges. And it'd be really interesting to see how others are dealing with that. And I think that is also going to be something that Aoife and Alexander perhaps explore as well. We then have Carol from SWGS Industrial Design working with Jonathan Kellam, who is the foundation course leader at Bath. The rationale for introducing the foundation course was we were interested in how students of art and design are specialising into particular subjects and seeing from level 3 how decisions are being made. Carol and Jonathan have made some starts with their case study. So, for example, Jonathan, I took some notes, he's run some sessions with his students called Think Again. What did he say? He said his students, at that point of running his workshops, his students were in the middle of a kind of specialism-specific module, where his students had to respond to a brief from one of 10 different specialisms from across the School of Art and Film, so fine art, fashion design, textiles, photography, fashion photography, interior design, creative arts practice. So they had a brief in all of those different areas. And for their Accelerate case study, the students were asked to consider the development of their current ideas as a 3D model to enable them to explore speculation as a kind of thinking process, which was why the project was kind of titled Think Again. So about a way of thinking rather than a focus on the approach, although the tools were relevant within that space. So they used Sculpt GL, don't know if you guys use it. So that quite basic Sculpt GL modelling program, which is really accessible. And they generated a series of outcomes, which were then placed within the A-frame space to consider the scale, impact, form and relationship of their work to others. And it's that example of form, the space, as well, part of the space for response and collaboration with Carol, I believe. But of course, it's been sort of slightly staggered as well. Who am I missing? How many was that? Jonathan Kellam. And then the final case study, which has also been realigned, which was Matt and Charlie from Bath Media Course. We are proposing that, hopefully, you guys are up for this, that due to the changes from their original pairing, that how would this work? Matt and Charlie would work with you guys in kind of SEM 1, is it? SEM semester 1 of next year, and they would be responding to the case study that you've done and would lead on it and their interest with the AR experience.
Okay.
So that would be something that will be kind of later in, well, by December, semester 1. So everyone's at really different stages, which is quite right. And everyone, I think why the case studies were developed were so that we were getting the particularities of each of the very different courses, very different teaching styles, very different approaches. And it's really important that everyone holds on to that. We're not asking you to change anything about your teaching methods, change your approaches. It's about embedding these in existing ways that you're doing things and how this can work. And if it doesn't work, that's why too. Let us know how it doesn't work. That's kind of where we're all at. So it would be really useful to kind of hear. I know you guys have been doing a lot of work with yours, so.
Well, I mean, if it's easier, we can talk a little bit about that, if that's helpful. And I think it's important to contextualise it. We've got, we had this, well, Chris basically nudged us towards developing this R&D group, which we did in advance of this, of being brought into this project. And so we were working on these workshops and testing some of these ideas before we even entered the project, and it was just a good fit. So there's been an intention, and we've been fortunate enough to have the resource to, well, the intention was to bring the VR technology and immersive technology into the curriculum anyway, but we wanted to make sure that we did it in a measured way. And it just so happens that as this project, as Chris started to make us aware of this project, and it made sense for us to participate in it with you guys, that that was the perfect sort of lens through which to understand what we were doing, and it's, you know, the tolerances of it within the context of the discipline, but also to have some perspective on, you know, the efficacy of it as a tool for teaching. But I mean, that's not a fixed destination. We know that this is just all part of the process that all of us are undergoing. So we've been in a good position to be able to start the process, because it's just been what we've been doing as part of our kind of program business, you know. And so we have we bought some kit, and we started to just tease out who was interested in it among the staff team. Matt, I think it's fair to say, with Christina particularly, no disrespect to others, but been very instrumental in actually helping us to formulate the experiences. And what we've tended to do in the first instance, and I'll shut up after this to let the people actually know what they're talking about, but what we appear to have done, from my perspective, is take a very, very simple workflow and identify that as a potential area for development for illustration. And it will be super low level compared to what Julian and his guys are doing, just because of the nature of our disciplines, I think, you know, where we're at technologically, to take that and really scrutinise it and work it super hard. So what does it mean for someone who's working as an analog 2D illustrator to take their ideas into a three-dimensional space, first of all, which is a big leap. And I think there are all sorts of things that we've still got to do and think about in terms of that transition. To get them familiar with bits of technology, and, you know, everybody knows that the big barrier for everyone is the sort of onboarding and actually getting those things to work and getting them to work in spaces, and dealing with the sort of idiosyncrasies of different types of headset. So we've had all of that. We've had a head start in all of that to try and overcome all of that stuff. And then when we get beyond that point, to think about, well, where do those things go that an illustrator makes, however clunky they might be, and they are pretty rudimentary often. What sort of outputs are we looking at? How do they connect to the discipline? And how do we take people through these different stages to get a thing that's been drawn on Gravity Sketch through and into, for instance, Frame, possibly via Blender, or out through a 3D printer? And it's starting to happen in the studio, so that's good. It's starting to feed through, again, in a pretty basic way, but because Marius, who's one of our technicians, is on board with this process as well, he's testing it with the students in an informal way, through just very small, local, sort of intensive workshops for students who are interested, really. So we've done that, and then we've also stretched that out a little bit further to a trade organisation called the Association of Illustrators, who've got a very big, you're probably familiar with them, they've got this big sort of network of commercial illustrators and commercial practitioners. And we sent it out to them to say, do you want to work on this project? We had a little bit of funding that we could support it to get commercial illustrators in. They've been in once, and Matt's also been working with those guys, and I'm sure give you a bit more detail because you designed the project, and they're going to come in again, I think, at some point. That's the plan, isn't it?
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. So they came in and did precisely the same thing, and we've had these moments where we've been able to just sort of sit back and observe. Well, you and I sit back and observe. I have to sit back and observe because I don't know what I'm doing with the technology. So we sit and watch how people are engaging with it. And it has been driven really by a kind of desire for us to upskill a little bit within the program, but also to think about integration properly, because it feels like VR, immersive tech, AR are pretty much going to be central or very, very sort of closely aligned with all illustration output in the future. It's the same conversation now we're having about VR as we were having 10 years ago about animation and illustration. And that's now a non-conversation. I think this will be a non-conversation in 4 or 5 years' time. So we want to just get in front of it a little bit. And that's where our case, is that a reasonable description?
Yeah, Darryl mentioned we took this phased approach. So I think I mentioned it at the last training. We started with sort of analog drawing workshops and produced a skybox and took that into a platform called Panorama. So very much staggered to get traditionally analog focused students into this digital arena. And the idea was we'd do that kind of skybox drawing, then introduce them to Oculus and Gravity Sketch, and then give them a palette, if you like, that then they can bring into WebXR. And so there was sort of 3 or 4 stages to get to that point. The last being WebXR, and maybe introducing 3D scanning on your phone as well, which might fit quite well with your colleagues at Bath doing the AR component as well. So that's where we were hoping to take it. And I think the stuff that we've been doing in course showed quite positive signs, and it's having a real impact.
Pulled up this just on the subject of things beginning to sort of filter through and into the course. And I mean, Matt's got some particularly good examples from BA, but I saw this today, so that was quite reassuring. Something is happening. The MA students are given a collaborative project as part of the second unit, and it's to produce a reader along a subject or theme. So, the idea of a sort of classic academic reader with sections of text that are kind of categorised, and there are things for you to sort of dip in and out of, or maybe sort of prick your interest in and take you into a particular sort of a space of theoretical investigation. But we kept the brief pretty open. But what's nice for me is that they've obviously taken some of the things they've been doing in the workshop. So the gravity sketch drawings, they've been making these peculiar models that are illustrative of the content, and then they built these little sort of foldy page things. Each one has a body of written content connected to the theme of technology, and they've been looking at things like thermal imaging and looking at MRI and CAT scans and looking at what constitutes illustration, but from a very different perspective using bits of technology. But more importantly than that is the fact that this thing exists, I think, is in a way talks about how these processes, they're just starting to slowly insert some of the training sessions in, will in a way prefigure how students begin thinking about what the possibility is for their subject, which I'm sure you guys know about as well. So that was quite nice for me. What was really funny was watching all the other staff who are not that familiar with this sort of technology, could just go, and also realising how clunky Frame can be to try and navigate with keys and trying to get around things. And how can I make the writing go the right way around? You've got to go to the other side of it.
Okay, yeah.
It'd be good to know what you're up to.
I've done is I've taken 2 kind of volunteer students of the highest level of what we're doing, and I've taken, for instance, there's some teaching material, possibly even for people who are presenting this material to their own students who do practical work outside of the virtual space. So this is a workflow, suggested workflow, possible workflow, feasible workflow for taking physical objects from the real world, using a scanner and manifesting them in the virtual world. So, and it's in a frame VR space. So it's a simple kind of like Tableau informational, very poor graphical skills, I'm telling you, or infographical skills, but and it's a stepped process for taking a physicalized object. So there's two examples. One is a head cast, a human head cast, and the other is a sculpture. And then the heads, so one was a scanned physical human head cast into wax. And then, and if you go the other way again, Darryl, backwards again, yeah, there we go. That's the digitized version. So that's the digital version in VR or in virtual space.
So that's the scanned object.
That's the scan of the cast of the mold. Yeah, the molded cast. Yeah. So it's a human to a digital representation. And then if you swing again further, even around the other side again, that's the sculpt with a texture applied to it. And if you go swing around again, you'll see that the process for that was a big clay bust scanned with the ion scan piece of equipment and then brought in to digital space again. And then down the end, there's an instructional guide about how to do that, basically. You know what I mean? How you bring it in, you have to reduce the numbers of polygons and all that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, then you have to turn it into a GLB, obviously, as well. I haven't got it done for Blender. The instructions use ZBrush and Max, but I intend to do one for Blender because you can do this entire process in open source Blender. But I haven't done it yet.
Have you pointed students towards this as a resource though?
Not yet. I mean, this is the first showing of it to anybody outside me and these two students.
So it'll be super interesting to see how they respond to it rather than just getting a piece of paper or something like that. So that's a different sort of experience, right?
Well, that was the idea. And it's, you see, this is new technology that we initiated in our program this year. The scanning thing is something new for us. We're used to making digitized assets. So I'm used to teaching how to people to make sculpts like this with ZBrush and in 3D, pure 3D. But then to link it to what we traditionally have always done, which is our model making, our sculpting, our clay sculpting, and bring that into a digitized process. So I thought it'd be kind of helpful for people both purveying information to others and as a demonstration of the space, the VR capability of the space, you know. Because I think Frame is great for this kind of thing, I have to say. You know, it really is. And I think Mimic can be really interesting as well. I think Mimic could be really interesting for collaborative, you know, a laboratory kind of thing. For display, Frame is really good, kind of, you know, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I guess the question is now is we've got two good examples there of curriculum for curriculum development and activity. I guess the question is now how that comes together as a case study is the thing we've got to try.
I mean, it's quite interesting seeing that because even though we haven't been working that closely together, there are a lot of parallels between what we're doing and how, because I've been doing 3D scanning workshops with an app called Plug, with a Q, spelled with a Q. It's this fantastic app that you can basically build 3D models and scan 3D models and port it straight into AR, put them in the room in any scale in front of you, but they're really easy to then bring in. I tried some into Mimic yesterday and Frame VR, and it's so easy to bring them across, and just the idea of some kind of dialogue between partners with these scans, with documents, I think it seems like a natural connection to them.
So essentially that's a case study, right? So you've got a conversation between two institutions around scanning and bringing 3D objects into the 3D space. And that's the case study.
Yeah.
Or a potential case study.
Yep.
Tick. Next.
That's so exciting.
Got a year off.
Wow.
So yeah, I think that just by having that conversation has now just made it a bit more clear about where it could go, and I think we just need to keep
It's focusing the activity a bit, isn't it? Because otherwise it feels a bit overwhelming. It's like,
Yeah.
shall we? Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just do that one thing.
That's it.
And take it from there.
It.
because that'll be valuable for everyone, right, to have that
Yeah.
conversation and have that, just share that knowledge, really.